Hello, folks. So recently I watched the movie Obsession, and of course it's a movie which has gone quite viral on social media, and a lot of my generation, especially Gen Z, seems to be resonating with the core message of this movie. So I decided to give it a watch, and I was very much impressed by it. In fact, it probably is one of the few pieces of Western media that I've really engaged with recently, and one of the few pieces of Western media that I actually really enjoyed. Of course, a lot of the movies, unfortunately, that are coming out of Western media, out of Hollywood and adjacent institutions, at times haven't been very good. They've certainly declined in quality over the past 1 or 2 decades. But nevertheless, this movie was a pretty good watch. A fundamental reason why it seems to have resonated with so many youngsters especially is because it is symbolic of the issues with modern dating, with modern relationships, with the breakdown of social networks. And most importantly, it speaks to the psychological and mental state of a lot of youngsters today, whether it be divided amongst gender lines or whether it be in relation to how they perceive forming relationships or forming bonds with other people. This movie combines essentially a kind of social dystopia with elements of horror, and it's an interesting watch because it essentially exaggerates all the horror aspect, further exaggerates but plays into the fears and the issues that many people have with a lot of modern relationships, whether it be within their friendships or with their supposed lovers or with others in general. Now, of course, a lot of people, especially those of a more religious or more conservative inclination perhaps, would be more inclined to argue that the breakdown of traditional institutions and of traditional networks and of social communities is what has led to these issues, to these problems arising. In any case, some others may argue that it is the institutions themselves which are the problem. But whatever your perspective on this is, I think one can fundamentally understand that there are some very deep and fundamental issues to the way modern relationships are occurring. But I think what this movie does very well is speak on multiple layers. It addresses the various problems that the two genders face on this issue, and it speaks on various layers of reality, and it addresses, I think, something much deeper, which I think oftentimes gets missed in a lot of the common narratives or a lot of the common analysis regarding such issues. To begin with, the name of the main character, or rather our quote-unquote protagonist, in reality he very much is the antagonist, Bear, is a reference to the whole would you rather be with a man or with a bear in a forest question that went viral on social media a while back. And of course, a lot of women gave this answer that they would rather be with a bear than with a man in a forest. And that of course startled a lot of men, and a lot of guys were quite angry about this. Of course, this is very much the kind of typical gender war slop or gender war brain rot that you hear of online, which really is just playing into the cycle of anger, which further polarizes in turn men and women against each other. And really and truly, it is just a form of rage bait. And I would advise people not to take such silly rage bait. It's there to make you angry so you engage with these algorithms more, so you further fall down these echo chambers, whether you're a man or a woman. But in truth, it is symbolic of the breakdown in social trust between the genders. It's also very much symbolic of political polarization along gender lines, or of just polarization in worldview more broadly. But this kind of answer that a lot of women give, which on the surface, seems irrational, plausibly so, and, for many men, it startles them as to why women don't trust men enough. You have to actually look at the underpinning emotional logic behind the answer that a lot of women were giving rather than what they were saying on the surface. And oftentimes, you have to actually look beyond the superficial answer or the superficial reasoning that a lot of people give and look at the more broader emotional underpinning for that answer, for that reasoning. And you begin to realize this when you see that oftentimes such, answers which seem to, portray men in a bad light or portray women as not, en masse or in general not liking men or in fact hating men. A lot of this arises from the insecurity or the fundamental, insecurity that a lot of women have because they understand on an intuitive level in the state of nature that they are very much vulnerable. This is actually something that Firestone, the radical feminist, touches upon. That, not merely due to the physical differences between men and women, where men on average are, they carry more lean muscle mass, they tend to be stronger, but also because women typically are the child rearers, of course. So, women are the ones who bear the children. And children, generally speaking, will be dependent upon the mother, and on a very physical level and on an emotional level as well. And so in a state of nature, women very much are quite vulnerable. And on an intuitive level, most women understand this. And hence, they have to maintain the social contract, so to speak, between men and women, where both men and women provide mutual benefit to each other. Thus, it allows for the society to function by withholding access to this reproduction. It's a bargain or it's a payoff with men, where men would protect or provide for women whilst she rears the children. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that there should be overly strict or overly rigid norms regarding gender, or there should be, overly rigid gender stereotypes or attitudes towards gender. And, certain societies which have fossilized over time throughout history, they often have displayed these overly rigid kind of gender norms or gender stereotypes. But in reality, these overly strict gender norms do not necessarily reflect the state of man and woman in nature. Rather, there are broad sort of distinctions between men and women on a social basis as well as on a biological basis, but these aren't necessarily restrictive. These aren't overly strict. And there is merit to the argument that is often made that a lot of the typical gender norms or gender stereotypes are based on these socially constructed ideas that have developed over time. And so in reality, the idea of, let's say, certain societal expectations of men and women, they are the products of historical development in many cases. So whilst there are obvious differences between men and women, this of course doesn't mean that, the expectations that arise from them or the stereotypes or the understandings which are developed from them are going to be or should be overly strict or overly rigid. And, there is actually a balance here where there is, of course, what there should be is an emphasis on the individual in and of themselves, on individualism, and of not setting these overly strict norms, let's say. But there, of course, is an understanding of the broader differences between men and women. And of course, they are equal, but, those differences actually don't undermine that fundamental equality. In essence, in their terms of their humanity, of course, men and women are different, but they are equal. They are both individuals endowed with the same basic rights and in many cases the same basic responsibilities, although those responsibilities at times will differ based on their gender, their biology. In any case, if you understand this fundamental point, you understand why women would rather be with bears than with men. Of course, it's not that the answer itself is what they are getting at, but you have to look at the underpinning emotions rather than the surface level answer that is often given, like I've said. Obviously, with a bear, what is any man or woman going to do realistically? It's a given that any person is probably going to struggle to fight off a bear and most likely are going to end up losing their life. But of course, with men, or when a woman is with someone of the opposite gender, there is an understanding that in order for them to be functional, in order for society to be functional, both men and women need to uphold their ends of the bargain. Hence, if the man turns out to be villainous or immoral or, an absolute weirdo or a creep, the social contract, which is based upon the mutual benefit and mutual survival of both, gets destroyed. And that is a betrayal of the emotional and psychological trust that women often have to place on a man to, achieve a functional society and to allow for that mutual benefit to take place. And so, of course, within a social context, a woman most fears that a man will be this kind of immoral, villainous figure. Hence, this is actually what obsession touches upon, which is that when a relationship starts to break down, what women fear the most is that having committed emotionally, physically, sexually, financially, etc., to a relationship, they fear that, the guy, imagine after all this commitment or after all this effort, this person simply turns out to be some immoral pervert, or he turns out to be some deadbeat, or even so simply as they aren't even attracted to this person in the first place because of some reason or another. Whereas for men, oftentimes the fear is that having a woman's attention and love, they end up losing that attention and love. They thus feel that they don't provide enough value, that they aren't good enough, that there is something wrong with them personally. Because again, going back to this social contract, men have to provide this kind of value to women in order for a woman to be willing to enter into this relationship with them. And hence, that is the fear that men hold the most, whereas for a woman, the biggest fear is that if they commit to this man, what if this man turns out to be something or somebody which I didn't think he was initially? This does explain a lot of the different responses to various problems with relationships, with dating in modern society. Whether it be externalizing hate towards men or women to cope with dating insecurities, whether it be the red pill response of, just become more successful, which essentially is quite materialistic or hedonistic, or whether it be the blue pill response of just be nice, or the kind of nice guy syndrome we see in a lot of people. And we see this nice guy syndrome play out in the main character Bear as well. Of course, the issue with the whole blue pill be nice narrative is that unfortunately some men have brought so wholeheartedly into it that they expect a relationship or attraction from women simply due to them being nice, quote unquote. But of course the world doesn't owe them a relationship simply because they are nice, or rather they lack the ability to harm or do anything really. It is essentially performative morality, a mask to hide the deceit of the lower self underneath. This can also be understood as a subversion of the social contract on the part of some men, where insecurity on their part regarding the value that they can provide to some partner, theoretically, that they might sort of get into a relationship with, essentially leads them to resorting to this kind of performative morality. The red pill in many ways is a kind of mirror image, or the other side of the coin, where it supposedly is about acknowledging the harsh truths of the world, but really it just plays into the same system which prioritizes arrogance, instant gratification, and hedonism. And essentially it's just the other end of the spectrum. And this is what it really ends up coming down to. In many cases, it comes down to an abdication of responsibility, an abdication of chivalry, an abdication of the social trust resulting from the breakdown of social networks and institutions. It is a symptom of the moral, spiritual, and mental decay and degeneration of society on large. Of course, for many of those, on the more traditionalist angle, they may assert that this is the result of the breakdown of, traditional institutions or traditional communities or networks or social structures, which has led to these issues arising. And of course, there is credit to that claim, but there is also the emotional angles and also the kind of spiritual angle at play here, which is that, so much of society has been enveloped by these attitudes of hedonism, of instant gratification, and also of certain other toxic attitudes which place unrealistic expectations on relationships. But in another way, it is also the lack of ability of people to compromise or sacrifice for the sake of their significant other, or people who they claim to care about but are not willing to actually engage with them on an emotional level. We see this reflected in the movie insofar as the social relationships, by and large, are incredibly problematic. The main group of 4 people that we encounter struggle with things like drug abuse, and they struggle with trust issues. They are incredibly toxic in many cases towards one another, whether implicitly or explicitly, and they do things like backstab each other and outright lie to each other. And of course, a lot of these things are more subtle. To each other's face, they are quite nice, but there is a lack of a deeper connection at play here. This is often the state of many male and female relationships and friendships, a lack of true brotherhood or sisterhood. I do think that this is more so an issue with male friendships than female friendships, because with female friendships, a lot of them are able to form these deeper emotional bonds and connections and can be more honest about their feelings or their emotions, but a lot of men tend to struggle with this. And unfortunately, traditional networks of brotherhood have broken down, and you see a lot of young men struggle to talk to other men about their own struggles because of the breakdown of those traditional institutions of brotherhood, let's say, all those traditional bonds. But furthermore, there is an emphasis sometimes within certain male friendships on not being too emotional, and that can be quite damaging to the emotional bonds that can be formed between different male friends. In reality and in truth, historically, there have always been male brotherhoods, or there have always been orders, let's say, within which men have participated in. And of course, these weren't perfect, and obviously no society has been perfect. There have always been issues with all of them. But a big issue in our society is that male friendships may lack some kind of deeper substance to them. And of course, it's not about being unhealthily emotional or overly sensitive to the point where it's unhealthy, but there is a balance where you should be able to talk about certain problems you have with your male friends and be able to navigate things forward with their assistance, with their help. And I think many men do need those friendships, but unfortunately that deeper substance is often lacking. Of course, within the context of the story, one of the characters, Ian, who is supposed to be Bear's best friend, essentially has an on and off relationship on the side with the girl that Ian is trying to get together with, Nikki, on multiple occasions. And they both knew that Bear liked this girl, but they still didn't say anything to him. Essentially, they both lied to him. Sarah, the other friend girl, the girl who is within the group, essentially has unrequited feelings for Bear. And although by the end he engages with them in a very problematic manner, which I'll get to, you know, a lot of these things, or a lot of the issues that arose within that group could have been averted if they had just been honest about how they felt, you know, and none of this would have happened. And of course, although with the girl Nikki, whilst, you know, she's obviously possessed for most of the movie and it's not really directly her fault, again, if she had been more honest that she only saw him as a younger brother, a lot of these issues would have been averted. But in any case, the greatest fault seems to lie with the main character Bear, because he tries to play the whole nice guy game or the nice guy act. He completely fumbles when he has a chance to, you know, ask the person he likes out, and then he just proceeds to brainwash her, essentially, just mind control her. Of course, you could forgive him at first, but when he realizes that she's essentially mind controlled by him, he just doubles down. He emotionally doubles down, physically doubles down, and essentially takes advantage of her, essentially assaults her. And then he gets his friends involved and his friends get killed. And then once again, he abdicates personal responsibility by essentially unaliving himself and leaving her to live with the consequences of essentially what are his actions after she reawakens from being possessed. There is thus an abdication of responsibility, but also of morality, and the kind of performative nice guy mask hides away the moral darkness underneath. Now, of course, there are various responses that you can give here. The more traditionalist angle, or in fact, the more spiritual angle that some may take and that I would perhaps give is that lust itself, or, uncontrolled lust, when taken to its logical conclusion, or should I say to its animalistic conclusion, is the cause of much damage and of much suffering. And if people cannot control their lust, people cannot control their feelings, it leads to disastrous consequences at times. Of course, there is also the abdication of responsibility in this regard where, one cannot take responsibility for what they've done and furthermore cannot be honest about the intentions behind their actions, which also leads to much misery and much suffering in the long run. But furthermore, there's something to be said about the predatory behavior of our main character. And it shows that a lot of people at times who are performatively moral or put on the kind of nice guy act, really and truly when they are in a position of power, they take advantage of it. And like I said, just because you are nice doesn't mean that the world owes you something, or rather, your lack of ability to harm does not mean that the world owes you something, because when you do have some kind of ability, when you do attain some kind of power, because you don't know how to control it, how to use it properly and morally, you end up committing heinous acts against other people, even against yourself, and you are unable to take responsibility for those actions. And of course, there were always warning signs, because from the beginning of the movie, it was established that Bear could not take personal responsibility. He couldn't take care of his cat, and in fact, his cat accidentally died by overdosing on some medicine that he failed to lock away properly. If that sounds incredibly goofy and silly and an incredibly sad way for somebody's cat to die, then that's exactly how it sounds like, because it's ridiculous. A grown adult should not be letting his cat overdose on his medicine, but unfortunately, that is what happens. He is unable to address the unrequited feelings of some of his friends. He is unable to take personal responsibility for his feelings for some of the characters, and that leads to this suffering in the long run. That is also why I believe that some of the greatest issues of our day, whilst certainly many of them are political and socio-economic issues, they are also very much the spiritual and the personal. The lack of ability to maintain relationships, to sustain meaningful bonds with other people are partially what is leading to the spiritual and moral decay of the society around us. This is why I would say that we can often be disheartened by a lot of these changes in society. We can be disheartened by the breakdown in social structures and institutions and of the erosion of morality. We oftentimes may find ourselves in a tough position in this regard. And oftentimes those who supposedly have this kind of moral responsibility have seemingly abdicated their moral responsibility, and thus we have reached the result of it. But we have to acknowledge as well that in many cases, society has never been perfect, of course. Like I've said before, every generation has its battle. Of course, there have always been issues, unfortunately, with social institutions, with the issues within these social institutions, with issues of how people have been treated in different societies across time. And of course, the issues that are faced by women, they aren't specific in modernity or in pre-modernity. Unfortunately, throughout history, women have in many cases been treated very poorly. And it certainly also is the case that in many cases societies have been dysfunctional. Our society may be incredibly dysfunctional in terms of social relationships, in terms of the collective mental state of our society, but it certainly is true for a lot of societies in many cases when they've decayed, when they've become decadent, when they've stagnated, when they've reached a stage of moral and spiritual disrepair. Ultimately, as the quote goes, civilization is destroyed by weak men who can't protect that which is honorable. We must reconstruct, like I mentioned in my videos regarding reconstructionism, that we must reconstruct and bear the mantle of a new civilization, of a new society, of a new era. We must take on this responsibility instead of merely being nice, quote unquote, so being performatively moral, or, just be successful, so just be more materialistic. We should attempt to be virtuous and just. This invokes a wide range of things, whether socially, financially, or physically. We can indeed be successful, but don't let it make us arrogant. We should obviously be nice, but don't let it become something performative, which blinds us from the spirit of what we ought to be. And most of all, we should engage with the world, but we should not let it corrupt us. As the Nietzsche quote goes, if you gaze too long into the abyss gazes back into you. Be careful when engaging with these things that you don't become something that you weren't striving to be in the first place. But most of all, in the aftermath of the social, spiritual, and moral decay of society, when relationships, when friendships, when social networks are breaking down, it is our duty to reconstruct them anew and to bear the mantle of these new networks and to try and attain them and build them up. And indeed, when our descendants will come and they will face their own issues in these social networks or these institutions, they will have to challenge them and reconstruct them once more.